You're listening to WJHS 91.5, The Eagle. Welcome to Media in the Making, a podcast where we look at the evolution of media from 1600 all the way to present day. In this podcast series, we ask, how have different forms of media evolved and changed culture? Media in the Making, where media and culture are always changing. Now, let's take a step back in time. It's 7 p.m. on a Monday evening in the 1800s. What do you think you'd be doing? Back then, most people would be reading the daily newspaper, excited to find out what had happened that day. Everyone knew the exact same information. Hello, I'm Maddie Cook, your host, and today on this podcast, I hope you will be able to learn something new about newspapers. Nowadays, the media is focused on all the social media platforms, but back then, there was none of that. The biggest part of media was newspapers. The newspaper industry was just taking off in the early 19th century. Over the years to come, there were also more newspaper readers. There were many ways of making newspapers, and over time, they improved to make the process faster and more efficient. The printing presses in the smaller cities started off with hand-operated presses, which had 2 or 3 employees operating them. Can you imagine how long that would take to make? Although it took some time, hand-operated presses were what worked best for the small towns. Doing this gave the small cities a good, steady process. By the 1830s, the U.S. had a little over 900 newspapers made. Even though the hand-operated presses were thriving in the smaller towns and cities, it just couldn't work for the big cities. So soon enough, the steam-powered and rotary printing presses were made and put to use. The steam-powered and rotary printing presses were ways of making newspapers faster and efficiently, allowing thousands of copies to be made in just a single day. Using this printing press was also a much cheaper way of making newspapers. The inventor of the steam-powered press was Frederick Koenig. The printing press was a cylinder that had printing plates. It was powered by a steam engine. This happened during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was also part of the reason the newspaper industry was thriving and growing bigger. Because the industry was rapidly growing, so were the people that read them. This led into good and bad news. The bad news was that the papers were taxed, but because they were taxed, it allowed people to get access to the news and its information almost anywhere. After hearing about all of this information and now learning how newspapers were made, you may be wondering, what kinds of things were inside of the newspaper? Why were so many people interested in reading them daily? The newspaper included things anywhere from culture to events and daily things occurring in the 19th century American citizen's life. Because of the diversity in the information in the newspapers, it appealed to both the general and more professional readers. Both kinds of people would be satisfied and entertained. This affected the public in a great way. Because this was one of the only forms of media at the time, everyone used and benefited from newspapers. Overall, newspapers affected and improved the way media worked in the 19th century in the United States in a very good way. To wrap it all up, without newspapers, the information wouldn't have been able to get to everyone and thrive quite like it did. Once again, I'm your host, Maddie Cook, and I hope that you did learn something that you hadn't known before. Thank you. Media in the Making is brought to you by WJHS 91.5 and the Eagle Tech Academy media classes. Media in the Making, teaching you about the evolution of media throughout history and its effects on culture. For more from the students, more podcasting series are on the 91.5 website.